Welcome to the episode of On Emergence, a podcast on what it takes to be a human being. I'm Laura Sagan, your host and a fellow human being. Today, I'm excited to talk to you about one of my favorite topics, and that topic is fear. Personally, the way that I began looking at fear is that it's this trusted friend that you don't like having around because they're telling you something that is just so uncomfortable and you don't want to hear it. You don't want to hear it and you kind of kick them out. Fear is okay to experience as long as it doesn't prevent you from doing something that your fear is telling you not to do. I'm talking about fear where there is no potential physical harm to your body and rather that being an emotion. So I talked about emotion in another episode, so give it a listen. But emotion is something that comes from your subconscious mind. And the subconscious mind, when it comes to emotion of fear, is coming from past experiences. So an example would be is that you're afraid of, people say public speaking, or you're afraid to start a project. And starting that project isn't going to cause a physical harm in your body, but yet you're experiencing a physical sensation, a physical resistance in your body to start it because of the stories that your body subconsciously is telling you to. And those stories could come from experiences in the past that you've had, or let's say observing your friend or your father or your mother going through some difficult experiencing, and you making the decision very early on as a child is that you're never going to start a business, you're not going to start a project, you're not going to ask someone you like ever again because of that sense of discomfort that you either experienced for yourself early on in your life or you saw a loved one to experience. That's what I mean by experiencing fear when there is no physical harm that's going to come from doing something that your fear is telling you not to do. So the way that I look at fear is that it's this compass. For me, fear, it's like this dragon that hides the treasures behind it, because fear to me is something that comes from the past experiences, some of my past experiences. And if I want to grow, and I want to grow, the whole topic of this podcast is growth as a human being. If I want to grow, I need to step outside the comfort zone, because fear is this thought that formed as a result of past experiences that then stops me from doing something that in the past caused me a feeling of discomfort. But here is the difference, is that I'm not the same person that I used to be in the past. You're not the same person who first experienced embarrassment when you asked someone out and you were rejected. You're not the same person. And yet, if you're still letting the fear dictate what you do and how you go about certain things, it means that you're still in that pattern that you developed when you were a child or a teenager or a young adult, or even as an adult. 5 years ago, you might have gone through a breakup and you told yourself, I'm never going to be in a relationship again. And that fear of being hurt, that fear of going through that discomfort is what prevents you from taking a step that your mind is telling you it's going to happen. So you're preventing your own growth. And I can tell you that it's totally okay. It is completely okay to stay within your comfort zone. There is nothing wrong. I don't want to guilt you for wanting to be comfortable, because it's completely fine. As long as you know that this is a choice. This is a choice for you to stay within the comfort zone. It's a choice for you to say, look, I know I'm fearful to start a business. I know I'm scared that it's going to impact my family, or I'm scared to quit my job that I don't feel fulfilled because I don't know how I'm going to pay my next month's rent. As long as you're aware of that fear and you are consciously assessing and you're being honest with yourself that this is what stands in the way, it then means that you can still stay within your comfort zone and that you may still stay in the job that you don't like, but at least you're doing it consciously. And maybe as you're doing it consciously, your brain will, and I promise you that it will, start thinking about other lateral scenarios that may help you get out of the situation that you want to get out, that your current fear, worry, or concern prevents you from doing. So the way that I look at fear, it's an invitation for me to look at the certain area of my life that I previously made a decision that this is how it's going to be because of a certain feelings of discomfort. I made a certain story, a certain pattern. If I do A, it's going to cause me feelings of discomfort, whether it's anger, whether it's sadness, whether it's feeling upset, lonely, or whatever that is, or physical pain. Like emotional pain manifests itself as physical pain. This is why many people are addicted to painkillers, is because the emotional pain that they're experiencing actually can be aided by medication that they take. So it's no wonder there's so many people addicted to painkillers because of the emotional pain that they're going through, not necessarily the physical one. So I'm not telling you to stop medication. None of the advice that is given on this podcast can be and should be taken as a medical advice. It is just an example based on the personal experiences that should be perceived as a story, as my personal experience with, in this instance, fear and emotional pain. Now, I know this about myself is that I survived 100% of uncomfortable situations I've ever gone through. That also include a certain situation that taught me that I should be scared of something. So being scared of something, for example, starting the podcast. It is incredibly scary. It's actually of late one of the most scary things that I've done, but I know that it holds the biggest capacity for growth because my conditioning, my ego wouldn't be fighting so hard to keep itself alive. And I'm going to unpack this thought a little bit more. So the way that our conditioning sustains itself is that we listen to it. We listen to the messages that our subconscious is telling us. And those messages, if we're not aware of how our subconscious patterns come about, we listen to it without knowing, and we act upon those messages without knowing. Now, if you're aware of it, it becomes a little bit easier. Then you become a choice. Then you can work with the fear. That's like level 3, level 4 out of 10 levels possible of your emotional management. Now, what I've learned about my ego in my yoga training is that it fights really hard to keep itself alive. Now, if you're not familiar with the yoga vocabulary, it's completely okay. Let's look at it as the certain subconscious conditioning that you developed when you were a child or even as an adult as well, because our ego and certain patterns of our thoughts, they get developed through our lifetime. And certain messages, they become ingrained and they become part of our personality. Now, what I've learned about my ego or about my subconscious is that there's certain defense mechanisms that are trying to keep themselves alive. And how do they keep themselves alive is that if I'm listening to them, if I am giving them my attention, if I am acting as those patterns tell me to act. Now, if I do it consciously, if I'm looking at a dark alley and I think, well, based on what I've learned and what I've read and what I've experienced, that going down the dark alley can result in me potentially getting harmed, and that can come from other people, or it can come from me not having a flashlight on me or twisting my ankle. If I then choose to act upon it, that becomes a choice. So for an example would be a few weeks ago, it was a rainy day here in Guatemala and it was already past sunset and it was rainy. There was not a lot of people on the street and there is a dark alley that I do have to go through. And I saw this couple of men kind of standing on the side of the road. As I was passing by, I said, hola, and I said hello to them, and I continued walking. And what I've noticed is that they have set off and I've heard them started following me. Now, normally, I am not the person who kind of becomes scared of these things. I'm not the person who gets scared a lot. But at this instant, I asked myself a question. Well, if I am not to listen to my intuition, and if I am, let's say, if something bad's going to happen, something unpleasant is going to happen, like if I get mugged, is this the experience that I have the capacity to deal with? I know that I will deal with it. I know that I will be okay. And even if I'm not okay, that would be the experience of not being okay that I was supposed to have. I will expand a little bit more on this mindset in the later episodes. But for now, I want to highlight that there was a point of me to choose, well, what do I do now? Do I turn around? Do I continue walking and ignore the feeling of fear and accept the risk of me getting hurt or risk of feeling uncomfortable? Or what do I do? There was a moment in time, and of course that thought only took moments. And what I did do, I chose my inner peace at that sense. There was a choice where I normally would say I would go home and I would continue walking. But in this instance, I was like, I don't want to deal with the potential circumstances. So I stopped by a cafe and I asked some people at the cafe to walk me home. Luckily, it's only additional 4 minutes walk away from the cafe, and it was fine. That was a circumstance where I listened to my fear, where I listened to the certain feeling of trepidation. I acted upon it. I let it dictate my actions, but it was a conscious choice. And in this case, that's an example of how I feed the conditioning that I had, is that 2 men on a rainy night after sunset in Guatemala, it may be dangerous based on what I read. And that's the narrative that could have been changed. For example, it could have been changed is that maybe they were not, like they just set off at the same time as I was supposed to, as I was walking by. But it was a choice of like, do I really want to deal with it? And the answer is like, no, not really. I don't have the capacity to it. Now, another example, if another certain piece of conditioning that I have in me, and I act as that conditioning and that fear is telling me, as that my ego, and ego, I use it in this instance interchangeably with the conditioning, is that ego is my personality. And personality is a choice. Personality is not just something that who we are. Personality is a choice. And fear is one of the greatest examples how you can change your personality by changing your actions. So in the instance of, let's say, starting a podcast or talking about fear and putting myself out there, putting myself on the line and sharing the experiences, is that I consciously chose the repercussions, the discomfort that follows, whether it's being editing the episodes, whether it's promoting the podcast, whether it's sharing something that may not resonate with everyone. And I'm accepting the risk of someone sending me, hate mail because of something that I've said. That is a conscious choice. And that is an example of where you can choose your ego, your fears dictate whether you want to do something or you don't want to do something. So for me, when I started thinking about starting let's use this podcast as an example. When I first started thinking about doing this podcast, I became very scared. And at that point, I already had this mindset that ego keeps itself alive by me listening to it. Because this is how I keep myself in the same state as I used to before. Because all the conditioning I've had before is based on past experiences. So this is where it becomes a choice. It becomes a choice because, I ask myself a question. Do I want to have my life as it is right now? Or do I want to introduce something new to my life, even if it means experiencing the feelings of discomfort, whichever way those feelings are felt in my body, whether it's not in my stomach, whether it's feeling nauseous, whether it's trying to numb my feelings of discomfort, whether it's fear, but it was a conscious choice. And the moment that I started feeling the fear in my body about starting something, and the more I thought about it, it's like, actually that's scary, but it's also exciting. So I sensed the fear. And maybe the excitement also came from the fact that I knew that if I'm scared of doing something as much as I was starting this podcast, it means it hides the biggest treasure behind it, the biggest lesson for me to learn. Now, I don't know where it's going to go, but I know that I will learn from it. I know that I will grow from it. I know that gives me the power to change the narrative and the flow of my life. Because if you get stuck in the pattern that you're currently in, unconsciously, without realizing that's what you're doing, you're going to live the same story over and over and over and over. But if you know that it is a choice for you to stop the story, to step outside your comfort zone, or at least to acknowledge that there is a comfort zone that exists, and you may not be ready, not in this lifetime, to step out of this comfort zone. That's totally okay. As long as you're conscious that the opportunity for you to learn and to grow from your fear is there, that's the only takeaway that I wanted to have from this podcast. That the fear is there for you to know where the biggest opportunity for growth lies. The reason being is because your fear is based on the past social conditioning and the past situations that are no longer relevant, that are no longer present in your life. So the way to look at it, the way to look at your fear is that an invitation to growth. Some of the situations that are present and current in your life are triggering fearful reactions in your body. And if you want to share some of them, I invite you to message me privately, to comment in the comment section if you want to discuss, and maybe your experiences are going to be useful for other people to learn from as well. And we can look at it together. We can learn from each other. So remember that. I thank you for your attention. Whether you tuned in to this episode on any of the podcast platforms or whether you're watching it on YouTube, I thank you. I invite you to subscribe to the podcast. I invite you to subscribe to my channel to hear more about the episodes and also to support this podcast and the content that comes with it. Thank you very much. My name is Laura Sagan, and I'm your host of On Emergence, a podcast on what it takes to be a human being.